Hi, everyone. Out of the infinite field of image and imagination, I've just chosen 7 problems, ones that I hope are going to fit the conference, and read through the really interesting list of sessions and papers that you're all about to have. And I picked out 7 topics that I hope will have some resonance with what you say. So first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about the fact that very few people have theories of what images are, and that's puzzling and interesting, that so many people can get along without thinking about what an image is, but that it might be a good thing in the end. And then a couple of slides on the question of what might count as something that's not an image, because when you start studying images, you tend to want to include all sorts of things, especially mental images, but then things that don't seem very visual, like pages of text. So there is this fundamental question about what you might want to have count in any given instance as something that is not an image. And then a couple of slides on a very vexed question of the relation between images as aesthetic objects and images as objects of political meaning or political action or action in the world. This is the distinction between aesthetics and anti-aesthetics, or between political art and aesthetic art, or modernism and postmodernism. It's a big problem, and I just have a couple things to say about it that I hope are pertinent to the conference. And then the question about the nature of images, it's a question of ontology. It's a philosophic question, which I think many people would prefer not to engage because there's a pragmatic or a performative or a practical way of dealing with images in different disciplines that allows most of us to avoid the question of whether or not images have a nature. But that question is very far-reaching, so I think it's important to keep it on the table. And I have a little bit on one of my own favorite topics, which is that I think it's fundamentally odd, perhaps even crazy, to try to classify images in the way that other objects, like mathematical objects, for example, can be classified. But classification in the name of the archive, for example, is an absolutely essential part of most research programs. So images are subjected to this kind of bureaucratization or administration in the name of many different projects. And so it seems to me also important to think about the psychological valence and the institutional consequences of trying to classify your images. And the last 2 sections have to do with a special interest of mine about limits of discourse in especially art history in my field, but in neighboring fields, the limit of discourse on the detail of the image. And that includes its materiality. So I've separated these, but they're actually combinable. And I'm going to conclude with just one screen with some very tentative answers to some of these questions. So I thought since I can't be there, that it would be fun for me to see a little bit of Bressanone using Google. And so I have just for fun to start out my 7 questions, images from Google Street View of the area where you are right now. I'm kind of entertained by the temporal and spatial dislocations of this particular lecture, because so you're right now somewhere right near this picture in that building, perhaps, and as you see this, I'm in, I think, Potsdam. But when I'm recording this right now, I'm in Chicago, and I'm looking at a picture taken by one of those Google streetcars of Bressanone in 2016. So I'm enjoying all these temporal and spatial dislocations. Anyway, that's just a background, and so on to my first question. Why it may be a good thing that only a few people actually know what images are, or think they have a theory of images. So I'm going to take my examples from this conference called What is an Image, which is now a book. And when we first started the conference, which was held in Chicago back in 2008, we began with the question, why ask what is an image? And I have 3 slides to suggest the kind of questions that 3 different disciplines ask about images. And this time my background images are pictures of a student of mine copying a Piet Mondrian painting in the Art Institute. And I'm going to come back to this question when I talk about the last 2 topics about detail and materiality, but that's my rubber-gloved student's hand trying to recreate very, very particular kinds of borders of stripes in the Mondrian paintings. They are not simple. When you start looking at them close up, they're quite complicated objects. I'll develop this in the next slide. So first of all, from the point of view of studio art, from art students, young artists, art makers, it's often assumed that the visual arts exist in a separate cognitive realm from language and logic. That's the whole right brain, left brain difference, which is largely disproved by contemporary neurology, but at any rate, it's very common still in the art world. So that leads to the assumption that some things can be communicated through the visual and not through other senses or media. And also, in the studio art environment, it is widely assumed that the visual is politically privileged. There are a lot of politically active art practices, and they can sometimes imply that political practices in general are optimally visual arts practices, which is a really interesting and radical claim that underwrites a fair amount of what happens in the art world. So these are reasons why people who are practicing artists might want to ask this question, what is an image? So just take away that so you can compare more easily my student's copy to the original. It has this very complicated three-dimensional bas-relief structure. The Mondrians in the 1920s do. They're not at all simple two-dimensional optical objects. They're hard to copy. So second, from the point of view of art criticism, art history, and art theory, many historians and critics work with other people's ideas about what images are. And there are relatively few theories that exist that are used and made by art historians and art critics about images. Hans Belting has a theory of images, Gottfried Böhm, Tom Mitchell, I'm going to come back to all three of those. Also Ralph Ubel and Wolfram Pichler, and I could make the list longer, but it's not a very long list. It's maybe not more than a dozen people who are currently working in and around art criticism, history, and theory actually have theories of images. And there's no conversation within art history about the presence of these partly or wholly non-historical theories. In other words, there are theories, general notions of images out of Plato, and all the way up to people like Belting and Böhm and Mitchell. And those theories purport to be able to describe images in general for our experience and understanding. But there's no conversation within the discipline of art history about the presence of those non- or trans-historical theories in an historical discipline. So they are themselves anomalies, these theories, and they're also quite uncommon. And then third, in the field of visual studies, visual culture studies, Bildwissenschaft, the German version of visual studies, and so on, there's enormous weight on the idea that we live in a very visual culture, perhaps the most visual culture ever, so it's been claimed. And Marty J. has said that, it's associated with Baudrillard. And it's even been said that we have come to think and experience primarily through images. And that's a claim that you can find in Nicholas Mirzoff and Lisa Cartwright. They both write visual culture studies texts. That's another really radical and interesting claim. And as far as I know, no one has tried to explore exactly what the consequences of such a claim might be, that we actually think through images. But very few visual studies scholars think about these issues directly, to talk about them directly, and there's very little talk about the nature of the visual. So in all three of these areas, art production, art history, and visual culture, images are central, but they're often taken as a given. In the event that we had in Chicago, the What is an Image event, that led us to this question that I think is a very curious one, and I'm going to leave it open until the last screen of this talk. What is enabled by not pressing the question, what is an image? In other words, how is it that not pursuing, not answering, not engaging this question, what is an image, how is it that that is a productive strategy for so many fields and so many disciplines? Okay, my second subject is another one of my Google Street View images. What is not an image? So here's another poster for another conference, and this one was in Berlin in 2014, and I co-organized this, as you can see at the lower left, with several other people. This was a conference which was intended as a critique of visualization and infographics and so on, because we had this idea that we're living in a period of a kind of visualization euphoria, where people assume that visual forms of the display of information are optimal for understanding and analysis in any discipline. So we invited a very wide range of people to talk about what they thought could not be or should not be or wasn't helpful to be imagined as a picture in their field. And here's our lineup of speakers. You can see if you look over the page, they vary from physicists to people in literature. We had a couple of literary critics who didn't nominally write about images at all. And I just want to say a little bit about the two that are in the red box. We had an economist, Werner Reichmann, who works in Konstanz as one of our speakers, and also Mary Morgan, who is an expert on visualization in economics. So Mary Morgan gave a paper on those very simple-looking economist graphs, the one that just show the first quadrant and you just get a line that goes straight up or down. And Reichmann reported on graphs like this one, financial advisors graphs, that show anticipated forecasts of earnings into the future. And you could see that from the moment of the present on into the future, the forecast has a certain error built into it. And Werner noted that, quote, "For some reason, the future is always blue in these graphs," and that was enough all of a sudden to make most of us think of them as images. The most interesting of the graphs, the slides that Werner showed, was this one. So this is actually just similar to one that he showed. It's not the exact one, but he was talking about working in the German bond market, and he said that there's one spreadsheet that people who watch the German bond market always have on their computer screen, because it has a continuously updating list of German bond prices. And especially there was one column or one row at the bottom of that chart that he showed, which gave a crucial number for the exact value of German bond prices at that moment. And he was speaking about this as an image. And the problem that he raised for us was that it was very difficult for us to say to him, that's not an image. If anything is not an image, that's not an image. It's not even a page of formatted text. The formatting doesn't matter, the color doesn't matter, all the rest of that. But we couldn't easily say that to him because the terms of his analysis were very closely related to the terms of our own analysis of what we thought of as visual material. It has a lot to do with forms of attention. The particular form of attention that he said that bond traders brought to bear on that one last row, maybe it was just that one last cell on the spreadsheet, was very much like forms of attention that we were theorizing using theories of the gaze and other tools like that. So this is the way that the question, what is not an image, came up in that visualization conference in Berlin. There are many other ways of talking about this. There are even theological ways, but this one seemed to me particularly pertinent, I hope, to your conference, because you have a lot of examples of, as I can guess from the titles of your papers, you'll have a lot of examples of analyses that could be applied to things like this that are perhaps not obviously to be thought of primarily as images, that they might be thought of as something else, graphs or charts or notations and so on. So this Google Street View I like because Google always blurs faces, of course, but in this particular shot I noticed that it blurred also the seal of your university because it thought of it as a face. So this is my third topic, aesthetics and politics, which is another enormous topic, but I also just want to approach it by way of one isolated example. So if you move the Street View car a little bit, you see the seal comes a little bit more. You see it a little bit more from the front, and then Google realizes that it's not a face. So this time I want to report on a conference, now also a book, called Image Operations, which was held in Berlin, and that's a photo of one of the two conveners, Charlotte Klonk. The book is published by Manchester University Press. Her question for the conference, the lead question there was, what does it mean that images are not only operations, like for example in medicine, in things like the Da Vinci machine, which is a machine that allows doctors to operate on a patient without actually touching the patient. They just operate a computer console. And in warfare, where you have, for example, missiles with video cameras in the nose of the missile, images are operations in various contexts. But sometimes also people are killed for images. And this is Charlotte Leclanc's example, as in ISIL videos where prisoners are executed. So images kill, images can prompt people to kill, and sometimes people are even killed for images. The idea of the conference was to push the question of performativity and the action of images in the world as far as it could be pushed, not just to say that images are performative and not just to say that they're something more than framed objects on a wall or environments, architectural environments, but to say that they can actually cause deaths in a direct way. So the conference was very much aligned toward the political and very much disengaged from the aesthetic, the entire history of fine arts and aesthetics of images. So I think that this question, in its general form, about politics and aesthetics and images is one of the principal unresolved issues in art theory. The problem keeps coming back in waves. There was conceptualism. There was Hal Foster's anti-aesthetic starting in 1980. There's Nicolas Bourriaud's relational aesthetics, his book with that title, Relational Aesthetics. There's a lot to be said about each one of those moments and others. There are moments in which the relation between the aesthetic content of an image and its political or social meaning appears as a kind of, like as if it was a vinaigrette, so it's as if in an image you have to keep whipping the oil and the vinegar together to keep them in emulsified. And if you let it go, if you just sit and watch, as it were, they keep coming apart again. That the aesthetic doesn't attach itself to the anti-aesthetic. So in the 2004 conference, the most intricate example of this was work by the artist Trevor Paglen. He has in his work a politics, a political action, which he proposes as an aesthetics, and he has an aesthetics that he presents as a politics. I'm just going to give one screen on each, and that's all I want to say about this topic here. So here is an example of an image by Trevor Paglen. He had a series of works in which he went he got as close as he could to military sites, and then he would get a telescope and take pictures of things. He didn't actually trespass in any of these military sites, like the Area 52, where the U.S. military supposedly keeps aliens and all the rest of that. He didn't actually trespass on them, but he would stand sometimes miles away at the fence and take these photographs. And then he would title them with the exact position that he was in and the name of the military installation, as much information as he could find in the public. So very specific titles to these pictures, but the pictures themselves were very blurry. You're just looking here at something that you can go and find online. It's a little portfolio that the New Yorker put together. So first, politics as aesthetics. Trevor says that his idea is to create a tension between the image itself, which means absolutely nothing, it's just blurry buildings, and the title, which can lead to or contain very specific information. So knowledge and beauty, he thinks, are in an interesting tension, and that tension is the work's aesthetics. So he wrote me this in an email back in 2009, quote, "A successful image for me is one that makes a statement and simultaneously undermines any possibility of a traditional truth claim based on that image. It's a sense of seeing or not seeing that I'm trying to capture." So that's politics as aesthetics. And then there's aesthetics as politics. In the same email, he says, there's also a performative gesture I'm interested in. What are the politics of photographing some of these things, even though the photographs themselves don't show anything? So it's the picture becomes an operation in the terms of the conference. It becomes something performative. There's a book that I edited, you see on the right, Theorizing Visual Studies, Writing Through the Discipline. And in it, I put this diagram. When I was thinking about Trevor, I thought it would be fun to make a diagram. That book is full of diagrams. So that's on the left, the Paglin diagram, in which I'm imagining in an unquantifiable way that Trevor's work is animated by the way it's pushed back and forth between politics and aesthetics. It's never clearly political. It's never entirely aesthetic. So it's the vinaigrette metaphor, you might say. It keeps the two things stirred together. But what I want to emphasize in this context for your conference is that I think this is an unsolved problem, and no one has a good account of how to describe social, political, ethical meanings of images and aesthetic meanings and qualities in the same sentence as part of the same thought. So there's always a tension. That's a shop that I think is just about a block or so away from you with some ads in it. So the fourth of these 7 subjects, do images have a nature? Is one of my this is one of my favorite signs. Caution, dust storms may exist. So there are scholars, like the German scholar Gottfried Böhm, who do want to understand the nature of images, the ontology of images. And then there are other scholars, like Tom Mitchell, for whom ontology is really something that other people believe in. And this is another very profound and not adequately theorized issue in image studies. So I just have also one screen on each of the 2 of them. That's Gottfried Böhm. In the summer of 2006, the 2 of them, Böhm and Mitchell, exchanged letters. In one of the letters, Böhm reiterates a question that he says guided him for a number of years. How do images create meaning? This question he articulates through a series of concepts that he invented, including an expression that he invented, the iconic logos. You can see in that expression, iconic logos, there is a contradiction of terms. He knows this, and he has spent a whole lifetime thinking about what it might mean. He says, the recurrent idea is to ask how meaning, quote, can articulate itself without borrowing from linguistic models or from rhetorical devices. In other words, being outside somehow language. Nothing corresponds to this to this kind of ontology in Mitchell's work. So there's Tom Mitchell. He's a good deconstructionist. He's interested in deconstruction. So for him, what matters is what you can say and do with images, not their nature. In the What is an Image event, I suggested that to Tom that Nelson Goodman's semiotics might appear as a kind of ontological ground in Tom's writing, because Tom takes semiotics like Nelson Goodman's as a kind of natural, unproblematic description of images. Therefore, might be even an ontology of images, a kind of a nature of images. And he said no, quote, it's just that Goodman has provided one of the most powerful, systematic, and wide-reaching answers to the question. But it's a question everybody has an answer to. The answers can then be made intelligible, more coordinated, more systematic by reference to Goodman. That is what I think is the great virtue of his generality. So this is a pragmatic or deconstructive approach to images in which what matters is how they make their way through the world, what people think of them, how they make people act, what kind of desires they set in motion. And from that perspective, images don't have an ontology, except in a fictive sense, except in the sense that other people, like Gottfried Böhm, might have beliefs about that. But I think this question, which you could say is a debate between ontology and deconstruction, or ontology and epistemology. This is another one of these fundamental issues in the discussion of images that is under-theorized, in the sense that I think a large number of us who work on images, who spend our lives studying them, really do believe that there is something about an image that sets it apart from other things. We do have an incipient ontology, but we don't usually develop that, and in effect what we do is, as historians in particular, we behave as if we were pragmatic if not deconstructive, and we look only at the effects of these things. There's a couple of wonderfully distorted Google Street View images right around, up and down the street and right through those two tunnels where people's feet get stuck into the foreground of the picture. So a couple of screens on what I think of as the madness of classification. Aby Warburg's Mnemosyne is still the model for most art historians for classifying images, even though it was a very eccentric project. But classification in some way is crucial and universal, because classification is what produces our archive, every researcher's archive, their evidence, their legible evidence, and their image knowledge. So classification is often referred back to the Mnemosyne project, but that project is not a model. It's just that the classificatory necessity, the need to classify in order to create knowledge, is something that needs to be anchored somehow, and art history tends to anchor it in this way to Warburg. But I think that Horst Bredekamp is right when he says that the administration of images is not well understood, and that includes things like their curation and their labeling and all the rest of it, all sorts of administration. And I just want to take 3 or 4 slides to suggest that there's a psychological dimension here. There is this kind of hopeless desire that we have to control images. So here's one page from a really remarkable image archive that is currently being curated by Marion Miller. You see her name in the middle there. She's at the Jacobs University, which is near Bremen. And she calls it the Political Iconographic Archive of Vision. This is the page for Pietà, the Pietà motif. And you can see it's all very indexed. It's done and computerized. So there's a lineage that leads from this back to Warburg, because Marion took over Martin Warnke's Bild Index, which in turn inherited Warburg's project. This kind of classification has gone far beyond anything Warburg could have imagined, and it's reached the point in the Jacobs University where there are people in the computer science department involved in classifying images, for example, from television, and no one actually needs to watch these images. The computer does the watching and classifying. So 2 other examples of the madness of classification, you might say. This is a selection from a piece by Lev Manovich, which he calls 4.4 Vertov 11 montage, in which he took each of the 654 shots in the film 11th Year, Vertov's film, and represented it in this by its second frame, the second frame of each one of the shots. So it ends up with a kind of a chaos that's halfway between, you might say, a Dada collage and a piece of pop art, but it also is part of Lev Manovich's computer-aided massive database analysis projects, which he applies to things like Instagram as well. And the third and last example I want to give you is this one. So this is a Google search by image set of results, and the search by image function in Google, at least up until a few years ago, didn't use any textual or metadata to help it find similar images. So I put in the image that you see small at the top. It's an image of microscopic 4 scenes of microscopic life. I put that in, and the Google search by image came back with this crazy list of images. The second one in the first row there is one of the world's longest icicles. And then you could see down at the bottom there's Hitler, and there's all sorts of odd things. This search by image function, when it was working without the help of any text that surrounded any of the images, and it was only looking at the images themselves, provided a new kind of image array, something with a logic that really couldn't be read. It has been read as surrealist, but it's not surrealist because these are computer algorithms. They have nothing to do with surrealism. You can, of course, read it as poetic, but that all of the available readings are readings into it. What it really is is a new kind of sequence that so far at least can't be interpreted, partly because Google's algorithms are secret. So these are just three examples. I'm just telegraphing them. I'm saying them more briefly than I should, but they're three examples of a kind of the kind of illogic that all classification results in. The classificatory impulse in relation to images is an odd one, because classification is something that was developed outside of images and is now being applied to them. Okay, there's another one of those funny scenes from the same street. So the last two sections here are about attention to detail and materiality in section 7. So in terms of detail, again, I'm just going to present one example as a kind of thought experiment. There are art historians who write a lot about detail. Daniela Ross has written a book on Friedrich Theobach, also has, but most of the time art history doesn't deal with detail past a certain point. And I'm going to illustrate that with some details of this Rembrandt etching of his friend Jan Six. This is actually a 19th century photo etching, so it's very close to the original. And here is the head in detail of that photo etching. And the next picture I'm going to show you is the most detailed image of this Rembrandt etching in a book. And then the next picture is going to be the best slide of this image at the University of Chicago, projected on a screen as it would be seen by a student. So the best view that a student could get of this. And the last image is currently the best available image on the internet, not including paywalls. So the point I want to make here is very simple, and that is that there's nothing in the literature on this etching or on the painting of Jan Six, which is more famous. There's nothing in the literature that requires anything more than this level of detail. A pensive face, a thoughtful person, a friend of Rembrandt's. Art history doesn't tend to go any farther than this toward images. It tends to read them at this level of generality. I know this is not an ordinary kind of critique of art history, which does have its moments of attention to detail, but this is the gist of what I want to suggest here. And I'm going to sneak in here a subheading, 6a, just to say a little bit about phenomenology. Phenomenology plays a part in this because I think phenomenology is a kind of default theoretical position for a lot of art history and theory. That is a nighttime scene of Borobudur in Indonesia. So there are of many examples I could have taken. I'm just going to name two major books that are in this sense phenomenological, in that they rely on phenomenological terms. David Summers' Real Spaces, which is a huge attempt to rewrite the entire history of art using conceptualizations, new conceptualizations, and Hans Belting's Bildanthropologie, his attempt to bring anthropological ideas into art history. They're both phenomenological in this sense. So they both have difficulty, or they find a limit case anyway, when it comes to details that are finer, smaller details than standard phenomenological terms from Merleau-Ponty, like horizon, body, orientation, symmetry, space, surface, and above and below. So Borobudur, for example, is in David Summers' book because you're meant to experience Borobudur by circumnavigation. You walk around it. There's a path that goes around and around in a spiral. And so it's the simple geometry of the spiral that counts for David, and not the very, very intricate series of experiences that you have with the bas-reliefs and sculptures as you go up. David Summers also writes about Teotihuacan, which is a ruin outside Mexico City. And its main feature is an enormous long avenue surrounded by pyramids. So it has a central linear symmetry, and that's what he writes about. And there's a view of it from the top of one of the pyramids. When the symmetry starts to break down, for example, the pyramid of the sun on the left is not symmetrical, then phenomenological accounts that have to do with things like symmetry and pattern and body and horizon have a little bit more difficulty, but they have more difficulty when it comes to the details on the pyramids. For example, this is the small pyramid called the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, which has these amazing faces of gods, Tlaloc and Quetzalcoatl, they're called, even though that was not their original names. But these gods stare at you from the various levels and from the sides of the staircase. But a generalized vocabulary has to stop, can't have, doesn't have much power over things that are truly asymmetrical and too intensively detailed. So my last example here is the tunnel that was recently discovered under the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. So right in the middle you see the same temple from the previous photograph, and they discovered a tunnel underneath it, and they're still excavating that. There are tunnels under each of the major pyramids in Teotihuacan, some artificial and some natural caves. And this particular tunnel, they've been finding amazing things. They find sculptured pottery, shells, but also rubber balls, pyrite mirrors, and clay balls covered with something that looks like gold. It's actually a mineral jarosite. And the last report that I've heard from this excavation, the excavation is slowed because they reached a place that was filled with pools of mercury. So the atmosphere is toxic, and they've built a little robot to go over the surface of the area here. So what I'm suggesting here is that books like Summers and Belting's, and by extension I mean large parts of art history and criticism that depend on the vocabulary of phenomenology, have a point of difficulty when it comes to details, how to attach the discourse of details to the discourse of phenomenology and phenomenological criticism. Okay, my last subject, and so here's a little bit of Benetton for you, a little Benetton shop. The materiality of images. So here I want to make just two observations. First of all, that materiality is it's a big concern in art history these days. But like affect theory, which is often associated with, there are many different kinds, there are many different theorists, so it tends to be polyvalent, and when materiality of an art object is invoked, it tends to be unclear exactly what is meant, but there is a widespread interest in paying attention to an artwork's materiality. Attention to its support, to its material, its medium, the thingness, and so on. So I'm going to give an example from the book, What is an Image? The conversation in that book. There's a detail of a Pollock painting where you see a couple of his handprints. So Jacqueline Lichtenstein, the French philosopher and art historian who was at the conference, said that art historians seldom speak about paintings, and she wanted us at our seminar to pay attention to examples from the 19th century, especially Zola and Huysmans, who, she said, really knew how to write about images in detail. She said, "In the distinction between image and painting, I would like to stress the painting's physicality. Today, in the age of the internet, it's important to recall that painting has physical and material properties." And Marie-Josée Monzen, who was also there, mentioned Daniela Ross. So there was this beginning to this conversation about how to think about materiality of images, in particular paintings, and not just images. So beyond the materiality described by Huysmans, Zola, and others, there are details that would seem to be difficult to write about as history, or to put it another way, an art historian would have difficulty writing about things like you see in this slide, because they seem to be just formal or just material, brute material. And so there would seem to be a kind of a barrier, a natural barrier, beyond which things don't signify historically, and perhaps even not theoretically in a cogent way, but they belong to something like formalism or some kind of close reading. In other words, there's a discursive boundary there. And that's another detail of a different Pollock painting. So I think it's actually possible to go further than these examples like Zola and Huysmans, and there is a more radical position. Quite a while ago, I wrote a book called What Painting Is, and that book, I set myself the task of spending several pages on very tiny details like this one, just 1 inch by 1 inch, to see if I could write about what was happening in a way that would make contact with some other themes, potentially even historical themes. So this is much more detailed than what Jacqueline Lichtenstein was talking about. I think that there are a lot of problems with that book, What Painting Is. One of its main difficulties is that it's not well enough grounded in history itself. But I would like to draw a moral from this, that it is probably not a discursive boundary. It's the problem of looking at, thinking about, and writing about the smallest details and the most specific materialities of art objects is not that those details are outside of history. It's that interpretation at that level happens very slowly. It takes a long time to figure out how to speak. And I think this could be extended to contemporary art as well. I had a student a couple of years ago, Boris Osterov, who was trying to outdo every other artist that he knew by using more goopy paint in his paintings than anyone else did. There's another one of his. And there's another one. So I think that these questions about how detailed you can be when you write about something like this, like any image, is an open question. And there is, for many art historians, the counterexample of Tim Clark's books, especially his book, The Sight of Death, which is about a Poussin painting. And this is a detail of a tiny part of a Poussin painting. And Clark writes about that green stripe that runs across the middle. And that's a very small detail for an art historian to write about. He talks about how it represents a field. But I think he could have gone even further because it's not even a single green stripe. It's many green stripes. So there's a lot more in the book. What is an image? So I know I'm running over time here, so I'm just going to conclude quickly with one screen. So here are the 7 topics that I mentioned at the beginning with some abbreviated responses. First, why it may be a good thing that few people know what images are. Well, because a lot of art history, theory, and criticism is enabled by remaining agnostic or vague about the nature of the visual. So something in what most of us do, what many of us do, is made possible by not thinking about the nature of images, as you all are going to be doing in this conference. The second, what is not an image? Well, nothing is not an image if the visual is conceived as a quality or form of attention rather than as a set of formally specifiable properties. The relation between aesthetics and politics, I don't think there is a good way of understanding how they work together. And I think it can be helpful in many cases to acknowledge the incompatibility of the aesthetic in a political discourse or of the political in an aesthetic discourse. Little bits of aesthetic judgment often come in unexpectedly into very politically engaged discourses and vice versa. Do images have a nature? Well, yes, if you have a stake in kinds of knowledge or expression that are only possible with images, but no, if you're more interested in what images do in the world. About the madness of classifying images, it's just something that many of us lose sight of. Maybe we have to. Maybe that kind of madness is built into the study of images. And the last 2 about detail, phenomenology, and materiality, just that there's a tremendous amount that's waiting to be written on the detailed, moment-by-moment, inch-by-inch production, existence, and meaning of images. And that's it. I don't have any more profound conclusions, but I'm always open to comments and questions. You can write by my website, or there's the email. And I hope you have a great conference. Thank you.